This is part two of a two-part conversation on artificial intelligence between Religica Theolab founder Michael Reid Trice and Mark Chinen, who serves as professor of law at the Seattle University School of Law. In this episode, Dr. Trice and Chinen speak about the role of AI in oppressive systems, the politicization of technology, facial recognition, and much more. Take a listen.
We've been talking about issues that are, say, 20, 30 years out, right? Maybe it makes sense to just speak to a few, more pressing or current issues. Yeah, let me just give some background on this, though. So, artificial intelligence has been used in a number of areas, but one is to describe states of the world. Secondly, to diagnose along certain criteria. Third is then to predict, so predictive analytics, and then maybe even to prescribe in a sense as to suggest or require certain ways of action. And in those four areas of functions, we are already having real world effects, right? So like in the area of facial recognition, as you know, it's being used in ways that are raising real concerns. Certainly being used in oppressive systems in ways that have hurt marginalized communities, or it has the potential to do that. And that's why we see outright bans in some cities for its use, particularly in connection with law enforcement. We know that predictive analytics are being used to review resumes, for decisions about in the criminal justice system for recidivism, to predict that. Those are problems that artificial intelligence has raised. And then, we've already talked a bit about privacy. Because of this power of algorithms and data, really to recognize this, in a sense, we are now at a point where it is impossible to remain anonymous on the web. Because with maybe 2 or 3, maybe 4 data points, we're almost instantly recognizable and identifiable.
The predictive analytics causes all kinds of moral complexities in the ways you're describing. So what about law enforcement? What about individual freedom? What about, as you mentioned earlier, the integrity to not have my future forecast by, assumed recidivism rates that are quantitatively perhaps accurate, but may not be true in the same way that experience in humanity. You mentioned also in all of this, this is the case with technology, that those who are on the margins can be criminalized and objectified long before they have an opportunity to defend themselves or to have some sort of surplus of integrity. What do we do about that in the face of artificial intelligence?
That's a very, very difficult question. The current approaches have been law, so that we have these statutory approaches like, say, algorithmic fairness, which requires at least some kind of auditing of the results of any decision making, say like insurance coverage or giving of a bank loan that uses some kind of algorithm with a data set, et cetera. So at least we have some kind of appraisal or accounting of the results of those decisions. We also then, as you know, have privacy regimes, which gives the consumer some measure of control of how their information, their data is being used, et cetera. And then, blanket bans on certain uses or applications of artificial intelligence. But as you can see, there are limitations with all of those. Maybe that's a way of answering your question, that it's really tough to prevent some of these abuses. And then it bumps up against views of technology. Like one is a view that technology is neutral. So, it's really the uses to which we put this technology that's what that we're concerned about, not about technology itself. But then there's this also view that technology is inexorable, that, because of the advance of science or maybe the market imperatives, whatever it is, that someone is always going to want to push the edge in our technology. And then the third is that, no, actually, technology is highly embedded in a society, and then therefore has its own kind of politics. As you know, as we've just described it, it's to be used for social control, certainly allocation of resources. Technology is deeply embedded in that. And then given the way in which technology is developed in modern economies, modern societies like the United States, there's often a close connection, right, between say, government assistance for development of technology and vice versa. So there is a politics to technology as well. So if we're really going to govern and prevent these abuses, we're really asking the deeper questions of how do we govern ourselves?
Predictive analytics, it seems to me the logic itself is based on an understanding of what's prudent for the most amount of people. It's utilitarian, English utilitarianism that you find also in the land laws that brought thousands of people from agrarian-based contexts in England, for instance, into the cities. Like, we use these kinds of what became laws, and maybe a really crude form of kind of predictive analytics, if I may, to move populations into places, to create socioeconomic hardships maybe for them, but of benefit to the few. And that's part of the ruse of prudence, right? That just a few actually have a demonstrable difference in their lives socioeconomically. The rest of humanity really suffers, those who become more in the margin. But there's something about the appeal to prudence it's both self-defeating in this regard, and it's a bit of a deception.
Mm-hmm. Say, because of our shopping behavior, and that's well tracked, as you know, there probably is a way to predict with a relatively degree of certainty that if I'm shown a particular advertisement, there is, an 80% chance of my purchasing it within X time of my being seen that, given the cumulative times I've seen that advertisement and all those kinds of things. And then you can immediately see how you can extrapolate that to other forms of behavior. So that's one thing, this idea that you can use this kind of technology for social manipulation. And then to your point about, say, earlier forms of predictive analytics, and maybe we wouldn't say not necessarily predictive. In a sense, we're moving into prescriptive analytics when we talk about, say, utilitarian principles of maximizing utility or happiness. Those are more prescriptive in my view. But you're right to say, though, they become justifications for policies that have enormous impacts on people. And it tends to be, at least in my view, that marginalized folks tend to always bear the brunt of those sort of prescriptive decisions that are often based on things like maximize utility.
In some ways, where we are is describing the current state to such a degree that there's a kind of moral Gordian knot, because an illegal one too, because prescriptive analytics, as you're describing, and their descriptive use that becomes normativized, it has its own internal language that doesn't like to be defeated. I know we're being somewhat vague here, but what may be prudent for you or may be prudent for me might be two very different things depending on where we are socioeconomically, using that phrase, or where we are in terms of our access to the goods of society, whatever form that may take. Descriptive analytics has a prescriptive value. There's an internal logic that is always on the side of the less marginalized. What do you think about that?
I'd say that has often been the case. You and I both know how you could take religious language, for example, and use it to justify slavery in the United States, and apartheid elsewhere. And clearly, you and I both know that those precepts have both strong descriptive and predictive and prescriptive impacts to them. So no doubt about that. I always wrestle, and this is, I've wrestled with this all my life, is I think that one of the central points of Marxism is that it is impossible to escape exploitative relationships, that one cannot get through life without taking advantage of someone else. And I have to say, there's so many ways in which that is correct. I wrestle with it if that's the only thing that is possible in the way in which people interact with one another.
Ultimately, we know that artificial intelligence used correctly, is beneficial theoretically to all of humanity. I mean, that's the aspiration. That's aspirational, let's say. But there are ways it's been incredibly helpful. But you have identified, I think, what is also a kind of core anthropological feature, which is the ease with which we are exploitative of one another. And so will that kind of, legally, will there be some sort of legal defense or legal, kind of capacity for safeguarding against what could be significant exploitation through this technological means in the future?
Yeah, in that regard, to the extent there are responses, I think the best responses at this point are to have as many stakeholders, members of the community as possible, engaged in these decisions about how we're going to govern artificial intelligence in its current applications. Again, I don't think there is a magic bullet. There are no true lasting solutions to this, but as a second best solution, I can't think of a better one, because and by the way, there are proponents of this movement in a lot of technology and development of technology. The idea to get as many stakeholders involved in decisions about how technology is developed and then how it's deployed. But as you can imagine, that's a very costly process.
A kind of appeal to an egalitarian recognition of the need for governance, self-governance, that is more inclusive than exclusive, would mean that the moral onus of our collective well-being, it has to take up residence in education, in the hearts and minds of computer programmers and the next generation coming out, and policymakers. Any of us today, really, who are looking at this advancement of technology, if we have it within us to aspire for a better world, then we all share, maybe in a postmodern world, we call it that way, certainly a highly technocratic world, we all share a moral disposition that is front porch stuff. It's right in front of us all the time. It's not tomorrow's morality, right? It should impact my vocation, my occupation, my career, whatever I name that. And that, I think, to your point earlier, has significant resonance with the kinds of religious traditions that for thousands of years have been calling on the neighbor as a non-theoretical entity.
Right. That's why I do think that these traditions have a very important role to play in how artificial intelligence will be developed and used in society. Of course, and I know that these traditions certainly have their shortcomings as well. They wax and wane in influence given a particular situation, society, or point in history. And this is my sense is that if you go to work for one of the large tech companies or a startup, et cetera, most folks I do think are inclined and want that their work to have meaning and to contribute. So the traditions have a role in developing and encouraging those kinds of impulses. Then we run into, of course, though, okay, yeah, it's great. We can talk about these things at a small group level, but if we start to expand beyond that to large societies and states, it's impossible to live out those moral principles because there are other imperatives that come into play.
You've been listening to the Religica Theolab podcast in the Center for Religious Wisdom and World Affairs at Seattle University. To learn more about the center's work and for resources to be used in local communities, visit us at seattleu.edu/thecenter.